In the last episode, we talked about the death of Marcus Aurelius. He has an impressive legacy both among his contemporaries, but also modern historians as well. As we saw, however, his age was the beginning of the end of the Pax Romana. Today, we get into the reign of Commodus. As we'll see, the new emperor had a lot going for him, from great looks to good advisors and a nice education, and he also had an important foreign policy victory. But for some reason, and I'm still not sure why, members of his family and also the Senate quickly turn on Commodus and set up a decade of factionalism, fighting, and conspiracies, and these represent the death throes of the Pax Romana. And so we'll get started on this phase of our story on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 55, Commodus, Born to the Purple. In the past few episodes, I've said a little about Commodus, especially his early life, and I don't wish to repeat the things that I've already said, but I do want to reiterate something. Commodus's early years were formed in a world that was rocked by several crises. The world's first pandemic was raging. His father's army got stuck in a war that seemed like it was not really possible to win. Banditry and crime were rising in several regions of the empire. Usurpation was a very real threat that his father faced. All of this stuff happened while Commodus was a child and then a teenager. Now, what I don't want to do is pretend to be a kind of armchair psychologist. I don't know the effect that all of this had on Commodus exactly. It might have had very little effect. It might have had a big effect. But even if we can't know the quantitative effect of all of this, we can, I think, safely say that the age in which Commodus grew up mattered to him. This was not the type of environment where Commodus could just ignore the troubles of other people and either imagine they didn't exist or literally be kept unaware of them. These were things that affected his family. They must have left some impression. In my book, Pax Romana, I speculate that health almost certainly was important to Commodus. Marcus and his wife Faustina had perhaps as many as a dozen children, and only a few of them survived. Commodus was surrounded by death in his immediate family. It was not an abstraction to him. I mention that because fear of death seems to be a driving force when Commodus is an adult. We don't have a source that gives us insight into Commodus's mind like we have from Marcus Aurelius and his meditations, but I think we can look at some of Commodus's actions and get at least a sense of what he was like and why he succumbed to certain character failings that it seems like his father, Marcus Aurelius, did not. Now, for all the things that went wrong in Commodus's childhood, he had a lot go right. He had what appears to be a very good doctor in Galen. We're told in other sources that Marcus spared no expense on Commodus's education. We can tell from Marcus's meditations that Commodus's education was second to none. Marcus thanks his great-grandfather in the meditations. He mentions education. He says he realized from his great-grandfather that education was, quote, the sort of thing on which one should spend lavishly. That's book 1 of the meditations. In addition to a great education, Commodus had a kind of charismatic aura about him. This is what the Greek historian Herodian says Commodus looked like when he first came into Rome in AD 180 after officially becoming sole emperor on the death of Marcus Aurelius. Quote, Commodus was in the prime of his youth, striking in appearance, with a well-developed body and a face that was handsome without being pretty. His commanding eyes flashed like lightning. His hair, naturally blonde and curly, gleamed in the sunlight as if it were on fire. Some thought that he sprinkled his hair with gold dust before appearing in public, while others saw in it something divine, saying that a heavenly light shone round his head. To add to his beauty, the first down was just beginning to appear on his cheeks. That's Book 1 of Herodian's history. Herodian didn't see Commodus enter the city firsthand, but he reports a claim which seems to be corroborated in other sources, that Commodus was a good-looking young man. And I think there was a spirit of optimism when he took over. This was a man that had been groomed by Marcus Aurelius for rule. He had a legacy of great emperors that came before him. It was an age of trauma, but here was a man who could very well lead the Romans out of the troubles that had plagued them over the past decade or so. Some of you know that Commodus will not end up with such a great reputation by the end of his reign. And so the question is, was he terrible from the beginning, or did something happen that changed him a little bit? I'll give you my take. I think we see some evidence of Commodus being a pretty scared and frightened person, but also one who at least initially listened to his advisors and maybe realized that he was out of his league, at least in the first few years of being emperor. And so he made some wise decisions. I think the chief among these was that he was able to secure a lasting peace in the north. This is one of the big failings of Marcus Aurelius's reign. Despite his philosophical views and his admirable character, he doggedly kept fighting in the north when it was clear that that war was not winnable. There were too many different tribes. They had too many different goals. They didn't like each other. They didn't like the Romans. It was impossible to reach good alliances with them. It was also impossible to kill them all. Rome's prosperous age was ending, and Marcus Aurelius seems to not have been willing to fully admit it. Commodus, or at least the advisors that helped him, were willing to accept reality. And almost immediately after Marcus died, Commodus's team was able to secure a lasting peace with the Germanic tribes along the northern borders. Now, hawkish senators like Cassius Dio claim that Commodus securing a peace is a sign that he was just a coward. But they're wrong. The northern border would be a huge problem for the Romans from the 3rd century AD onward. It was across that border that the hordes that ended up taking most of the West would cross. And yet Commodus was able to fortify that border for 50 years. Commodus got the tribes to provide the Romans with over 20,000 soldiers. They would give the Romans an annual tribute of grain. This is a big deal because, as I mentioned in a previous episode, the food supply was faltering at this point. Commodus also put in strict rules against assemblies, so the tribes could not gather unless a Roman military official was present to witness what was happening. Commodus also worked with his people, probably some of whom were native diplomats, to get the tribes to agree to various ceasefires with each other. And this promoted stability in the region. Rome did not feel compelled to have to go in and deal with skirmishes among these tribes as long as the ceasefires held. And in this case, they did. The historian Herodian claims that Commodus gave the northern tribes, quote, everything they demanded. That's clearly not true. And his sweeping diplomatic efforts that took a matter of months were far more productive than the years of war that Marcus Aurelius fought. So I think that is something in Commodus's favor. But yes, definitely the war hawks in the Senate did not like the war ending. So when he entered Rome in triumph in the year 180, claiming final victory over the Germans, I expect the broader population were very excited while the senators, at least some of them, were muted and apprehensive. They weren't sure exactly what the new regime would mean for them and their favorite policies. But Commodus did what he was supposed to when he entered Rome, again, probably on the good advice of those around him. He entered the Senate. He gave a formal address to these men whose support he needed. He talked about Marcus, his father, told stories about him, and generally praised him. This, of course, was a good sign. And Marcus was made a god by the Senate. Commodus then toured the various temples, offering sacrifices to all the traditional deities of Rome, showing his piety, making sure the gods would be on his side. Again, all of this is important. What Commodus is doing is taking up the responsibilities of an Augustus-like figure, of a person whose job it is to interpose themselves. Commodus, in other words, is being seen publicly doing the thing that he's supposed to do. So he's not just being given the role of emperor, he is earning it. He is willing to do what is required. We don't have a lot of indication at this point that the icky things that would come to define Commodus's final years were actually present. Things like fighting gladiators, indulging in debauched behavior like drunken orgies and other such signs of enslavement to the passions. And so it's a little bit perplexing to me how quickly the Senate seemed to turn on Commodus, and I'm not exactly sure the reason why, but they do. In the year 182, just 2 years after Commodus took over, his sister, supposedly, Lucilla. This is the woman that was married off to Lucius Verus when she was an early teenager. She was then widowed when Lucius Verus died. This is Commodus's older sister. She supposedly was the ringleader of a conspiracy against Commodus. Again, it's unclear why, but members of the Senate help her out. What happened is Commodus was attending an event in one of Rome's arenas, maybe the Colosseum, who knows. And normally he would be surrounded by bodyguards, and supposedly they were pretty nearby, but they were just not immediately right next to him. Either way, he was approached by somebody he trusted, a relative of his, and he bursts out with a dagger. Now, instead of just stabbing Commodus right away, which almost certainly would have meant success, the assassin decides to give a short speech. It wasn't a long one, but it was long enough to allow Commodus's guards to catch up. The assassin said something like, "I bring a message from the Senate," or "the Senate sends you this," and then he's showing his dagger. It was just a sentence, but the guards caught up. Commodus was able to get away, and the assassin was executed along with several senators that supposedly had joined in with the conspiracy. Lucilla's role was found out as well, and Commodus had to deal with her a little bit more quietly. She was, after all, the most prominent female member of the imperial family. So he exiled her to the island of Capri and then sent an assassin to murder her just a few months afterwards. For many of Rome's emperors, an assassination attempt can be the thing that causes them to descend into paranoia, which then causes them to indulge in bad behavior, which then, ironically, brings about further assassination attempts. And indeed, as we'll see on the next episode, from this point on, the tumult in Commodus's reign begins to accelerate. Commodus will forego relying on the advisors that had helped him until now, and instead, Commodus will forsake the Senate and turn to those closest to him, even though they are of lower social status, slaves, freedmen, and women in particular. Chief among these will be a man named Cleander. Cleander's story culminates with a riot in the capital city of Rome, which appears in many ways to be staged. It's a fascinating conspiracy theory during the reign of one of Rome's most troubled emperors, and we'll talk about it on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.